Right, you're very welcome along to episode 4 of Keith Wood's State of the Union. This is the show where we grapple with the very future of the game. We've been around the world so far at Michael Check and Andrew Mertens on last week, but it's much closer to home this week. And I'm delighted to say we're joined by Philip Browne, the Chief Executive of the IRFU. Philip, how are you getting on?
We're doing all right. It's like everyone else, trying to adjust to the new normal. IRFU is working remotely for the last nearly 10 weeks. And so like many other people, it's just getting used to it.
Yeah, it definitely takes a little while to get used to. Keith, this is the part of the show where I hand over and you kind of set the table for what the discussion is going to be like over the next hour. What do you want to talk to Philip about?
Yeah, hiya Philip, how are you doing? Look, we're taking the time during lockdown to explore the game we love, I suppose, an off-the-ball discovery of some of the issues surrounding the game, a rough look at the finances and how they work, a look at how situations elsewhere in the world have an impact on Irish provincial and international games. We also want to have a little look at the domestic game and where that fits in. And I think if we were to kind of break it back to before COVID, how would you have said that the finances of the game were before this crisis happened?
I think we would have been in a fairly good place, to be honest. I mean, professional rugby at the best of times is a marginal business. But we were effectively making sure that we washed our face in terms of the professional game, and more than that, we were producing a dividend which went back into the amateur game. Because at the end of the day, that's the rationale behind all of this. There's no point being involved in the professional game just for the sake of it as a rugby union. It's to generate the funds to support the grassroots game. So we were in a good place. We had sold Newlands last year, and the proceeds of that were used to purchase the office building that we operate out of in Lansdowne Road, and we were saving about 600,000-700,000 in rent, and that money was being pumped directly into the amateur game. The international game and the attendances at the Aviva Stadium were second to none. We were managed to, over the last number of years, fill nearly every game by good pricing and good marketing, and obviously the good performance of the national team obviously helps as well. And at provincial level, it was working well as for them as well. Albeit, having said that, we just about wash our face.
Yeah, it is at provincial level. It becomes incredibly tight, and the finances are always very, very tight. Can you explain the sort of pressure that we're under to deal with the salaries because of what happens overseas?
The 70 miles of water between us and the UK is really important, because that's it is a disincentive for players to some extent to actually move away from their family, their support networks, and all the rest of it. And you'll know more about that than me, Keith. But the reality is that the market in the UK, well, in England specifically, and the market in France were certainly very buoyant. I think the market in the UK probably tailed off somewhat in the last probably 12 months, plateaued. Market in France for cachet players is still very buoyant. The other market that's emerged really over the last number of months or last 6-12 months has been Japan. It was always there, very attractive for South Africans. A lot of South Africans there, quite a few New Zealanders and Australians, but we're now beginning to see a move from Europe across to Japan in terms of some of the English players have started to move across, and that's obviously a very buoyant market indeed. We've always taken pride in the fact that we put the players first, player welfare. We look after their training loads, their playing loads, and that and the 70 miles of water between us and the UK are really of a great advantage to us.
Do you think that the Saracens' huge overspend and their breaches, do you think that had an impact across the game in Europe? Did that force other unions or other clubs to have to pay more to keep their players?
I certainly think in the UK it had an impact. France and the market in France is pretty self-contained, and they do their own thing. it probably had some impact in terms of some of our cachet players here in Ireland, in that certainly there was a player inflation, wage inflation over the last 18 months. But we've always taken a view that we know what we can pay, and we don't go beyond that. And if someone ultimately wants to move for money, we can't stand in their way.
If we look back at the pre-COVID period of time, would you have said that model in Ireland was a sustainable model?
I think it was, yeah. I think very much so. It's effectively the national team was subsidising the provinces, and also subsidising the amateur game. So as long as we can continue to do that, and that the values generated by the national team were right up there, I think we were in a sustainable situation. We also moved with David Nusafora coming in, a lot more emphasis and a lot more money has been spent on the pathways. So we were starting to see the fruits of that, really, in terms of young players coming through into the professional game in a better state of preparation, both physically, mentally, and in terms of their awareness of the game itself. So, and I suppose the evidence of that was the under-20 team this year, and the unbeaten in the Six Nations. Unfortunately, we're missing the tail end of that. But we've had a good record with under-20s over the last couple of years.
And just a slightly retrospective thing, because you've been at the helm pretty much the whole time of professional rugby. I remember you there in the amateur days that we were both there at the same time. Would you have done anything differently? Or would you have liked to have seen rugby have done something differently in that period of time?
In hindsight's a wonderful thing. Maybe we should have been a bit braver at the start of the professional game. We ended up in a situation where most of the national team in the late 90s were actually based in England, and that wasn't you being one of them. And I mean, yes. At the end of the day, that probably was not as we should have been maybe a little braver at that stage. Having said that, I think there were advantages in not being first mover. I think we were able to see the mistakes that others had made. And when we did embrace professionalism after the 1999 World Cup, I mean, I think that was a real eye-opener. We effectively said, listen, we're either in the game or we're going to be trailing in the wake of everyone else. And you can't be half professional in a professional game. And there's, as I've said before on many occasions, there's no reward in professional sport for mediocrity. And I think that would have been maybe one of your own views as well at the time. And we would have had discussions about that at the time. So, we embraced it. And by embracing it, I think, we managed to get to where we are. I think, by and large, yeah, there's some things we could have done better. There always is. But I wouldn't have changed that much, to be honest.
If the current crisis hadn't happened, what were the expansion plans? What was the ambition to improve the pathway so that your player base widens and actually you just become self-sufficient even if players do move away? Or were you looking to expand into other markets? What was the future of the club system, the provincial system, and the international team?
Well, one of the first things that David Nusafora observed when he came here 5 years ago was that we really hadn't put the resources into the pathway that needed to be put in, and it's really about putting the supports around the individuals at provincial level, and those supports being medical, strength conditioning, and then the rugby supports in terms of the tactical and getting an understanding of the game. So I think, we have put quite a bit of additional monies over the last 3 years, 4 years into that whole area. And there's still some work to be done on some of the academies. They probably aren't quite as effective as they should be. But the reality is the greatest thing we have going for us is a throughput of talent coming into the system, because otherwise you're reliant on holding on to players in a European market and potentially a global market. And that is not a sustainable situation really for anyone to be in. You need to have the pressure coming up from underneath, so that if players do wish to go abroad, that's fine. But we have plenty of good players coming up behind them. And that, I think, has been a focus of David's work and a focus of the work of the National Professional Game Board over the last number of years. In terms of the wider scheme of things, Pro 14, we obviously want to make Pro 14 a competition that's recognizable on an international stage. And to be fair, I think it is. It probably has as many international players playing in the Pro 14 as certainly Super Rugby, and more internationals playing in the Pro 14 than there would be in PRL or indeed the top 14. So the quality of the rugby is actually good. You guys, Keith, you can be a better judge of that than possibly me. But I think the quality has improved immeasurably, and it's really about reaching out to new markets. And CVC and the deal with CVC is very much about reaching out to new markets. It's about trying to tap into the experience and the marketing new and the sports marketing experience of CVC to try and build the Pro 14 as a brand and build it as an attractive proposition.
Philip, are you nervous about having a private equity company coming in? Are they essential partners to the game now?
I think they're essential partners to the game. I think we're very comfortable that the deal between CVC and the Pro 14 is actually a deal with each of the unions involved, who are the shareholders of the Pro 14. So it's quite different to the sort of deal that would have been done with PRL, which was a deal really with the club owners. And so from our point of view, we're satisfied we put the protections into the arrangements with CVC that ensures that the control of the game, the way in which the game develops, the laws of the game, the regulations, all of that lies 100% with the unions.
And could you see a possibility of where, because CVC are in the Premier League or the Premiership and in the Pro 14, that they could have an amalgamation, or it could try and change the structure? Is that something that could be on the tables to be maybe a more potent competition?
Yeah. Well, I think the answer is I don't know, and I think CVC need to get their feet under the table and work with Pro 14, work with PRL, work with EPCR, because effectively they have a major influence now in terms of the European club competitions. And I think the fact that we have a shared stakeholders between PRL, Pro 14, with influence in EPCR, I think it will help put a fair degree of shape on how the European professional game develops in the future. And I think that's probably a good thing. I think we've always had disparate views between the unions and jurisdictions as to how the professional game should develop, what it should look like. And I think having an independent party, for want of a better term, sitting in with a vested interest themselves will help, I think, bring about, I would hope, a greater degree of coherence in the professional game in Europe. And I think that'll be a great benefit, not only to European rugby, but to world rugby.
There was a lot of conversation on the previous chats that we've had, and we've talked to people all over the world. And you mentioned it at one stage that one of the key components for the IRFU is their ability to manage game time, to manage the amount of minutes that a player plays, to pretty much manage the length of their season, and to have that level of control. And yet everything else that seems to come out of World Rugby or any of the club owners or different unions is, well, if we can have another competition, if we could play a world final, a club final, maybe we could have a World Cup, the equivalent of that every year. Can we amalgamate everything else in? It seems as if there's too much rugby going on, being stretched far too much, and I don't know where that sits with player welfare.
Yeah, and that's been part of the problem over the last 15 years or more. I've been involved in discussions for 15 years in various shapes and guises as to what the world or the global season should look like. And one of the frustrating things is that because everyone has disparate views and everyone has vested interests in terms of holding on to what they have, and we'd be the same as anyone else in terms of the Six Nations in that regard, I'd have to say, but it becomes very difficult to actually change things. And unfortunately, the compromise always seems to be on player welfare, which is just an unsustainable position. And we would be very, very strong on making sure that the players are not overpaid, or at least in a centralized system like we have, we can at least manage the playing time and the training load. But this notion that the top players in the world are going to play every game in a club season plus international rugby is simply not. It's not tenable. And I think that's the biggest issue. Is that the easy answer is let's have another fixture and we get more money. It's I think there's less is more, and quality over quantity is something that you'd like to think would work. But that requires the cooperation of everyone across the board, the club game, the international game. It also requires the cooperation of sponsors and broadcasters. And at times it's hard to corral all of those different entities into the one space and moving in the same direction. And to be fair, I think that's what we're trying to do at the moment. I think the COVID-19 crisis is, given us a spur on in terms of, listen, can we just try and see if we can get this to work? So SANZAR and Six Nations, as you know, are meeting to try and tease all of this out. I think part of the problem in the past is, we've had too many people, too many cooks in the room. I think if we just have a small group looking at it, maybe we can move things on. Having said that, the challenges are significant, and it'll be, I think player welfare has always been one of the big issues and one of the hurdles that we've had difficulty in getting over.
If the Six Nations and SANZAR are sitting in the room, are the French clubs representatives there, or the English clubs?
No, I think effectively what we're going to do is there's a working group between SANZAR and Six Nations looking at this, how the structure of the international season would look like. And I think now we're moving into a stage where there's going to be a greater level of engagement with all the other stakeholders. Obviously the clubs in France and England, Pro 14, Super Rugby, all have to be involved. The players obviously have to be consulted as well. So we're now at a point where we're going out to a wider stakeholder engagement with some potential options. I think it's a work in progress, and I'd say there's a bit of water to go under the bridge yet.
It sounds like for the first time, though, that you're genuinely hopeful we might have a global calendar. I thought those comments towards the end of last week were the strongest I've seen from anybody in one of the leadership roles for any of the unions about, look, there is a big opportunity here with the crisis to have a global calendar that actually works for everybody.
Yeah, well, as they always say, never waste a good crisis. So I think it's the right time to look at it. There's a lot of other stuff going on which has been pretty revolutionary, I suppose, in the conservative world of rugby. And I think the Project Light, which is the Six Nations project to effectively aggregate all their TV rights across the autumn internationals and the Six Nations, has been a move in the right direction. And I think to take that a step further is to aggregate the rights of incoming tours, outgoing tours, and try and see if by aggregating rights that you can actually generate a greater level of interest from broadcasters, with the possibility of maybe doing some sort of OTT channel, which effectively gives all the rugby punters, for want of a better term, a one-stop shop for rugby. Because at the moment, the difficulty has been that if you want to watch international rugby, in the autumn, you could be looking at it on 3 different channels. You could be watching 2 games at the same time. It just doesn't make any sense, and we're shooting ourselves in the foot as a sport. So it's trying to put some shape and coherence on things. And I think that whole project was a step in that direction. And I think this work on looking at seeing if we can align the global season a little bit better is another obvious step to take.
One of the points that comes up, especially for the autumn internationals, is a little bit of the envy that happens from the Southern Hemisphere teams, because when they come up and play in the Northern Hemisphere, we fill out our stadia, we reap the benefits of that. They don't derive any income from that, is that correct?
No, they don't, but they derive income from the tours when we tour in the Southern Hemisphere, and they also derive income every 4 years from the Lions Tour, which is huge. So the sort of international rugby economy is not as unbalanced as some would lead you to believe.
Mind you, the ticket price that you'll get in the Aviva could be 3 or 4 times what you might get in Dunedin. True,
but I mean, the reality is the Lions Tour can generate 40 million, 50 million for the host union. So, you know, when you add it all up, the rugby economy is not as unbalanced as people would maintain. Having said that, you can go and watch Ireland play New Zealand in Auckland, and the top ticket price might be 40 quid, whereas the top price here in Dublin might be 100 quid. So you're right. There's a difference in terms of the pricing. There's a difference in terms of the market economies, but equally there's a difference in terms of the way in which the game is run and the cost base of the game in Europe. Player salaries are obviously much more significant up in Europe. Equally, for a lot of the nations in Europe, we've had to build our own stadia and invest in our own stadia, and that's not the case in Australia or New Zealand. I mean, the best option is obviously just simply to rent a stadium. You don't have the headache of trying to keep it running, trying to make it wash its face. So it's complicated, and you know, you can listen to some people and they would maintain it's very simple. Southern Hemisphere countries need to get a share of the revenues up here. Well, maybe they should also take a share of the costs as well.
It's funny because Michael Cheika was actually wishing that they had their own stadium and citing Ireland as an example. So it seems grass is always greener no matter which hemisphere you're in. But what would the benefit of a unified season actually be? Why would it help Northern Hemisphere, and why would it help Ireland to have a calendar year where, say, the Six Nations was pushed back a month and the Rugby Championship happened at the same time?
Well, I think it's not so much a help for Ireland in that at the end of the day, we're in control of our players. It's really in those countries where there isn't the same level of control, and particularly England. And I think if you can decouple the club season from the international season, it becomes much easier for the clubs to have clarity as to how they play or how they structure their competitions, and knowing when they have their players. For us, it's different in that we can control our players in terms of when they play and when they train. So it's from our point of view, it's a case of, well, if this is the way that the rest of the rugby world wants to move, you know, we shouldn't stand in the way of it. But I think that probably the big advantage for us is by getting some sort of cohesion and coherence across the game. It will increase the value of the game for sponsors, broadcasters, and ultimately, hopefully, the rugby public as well.
That's exactly what CBC did with Formula One before ultimately selling it out to Liberty Global. They relaxed all of their media rules. Bernie Ecclestone used to not let people do any video. Even the team members themselves couldn't have their phones with them to film stuff. Bernie Ecclestone shut it down straight away. So when CBC came in, apparently the Formula One team didn't actually know how to tweet properly or upload video to YouTube. It was a huge learning experience for them, but it massively increased the interest and access that people had. And you could see the knock-on benefit for everybody. CBC have been, in many cases, painted as this rampaging, villainous capitalist force who are going to come in and slash rugby and, make a profit and leave. But in many ways, what they've done is they've forced the unions to work with each other with a long-term view and a plan to try and give value back to the investors in CVC, but also to do that with a coherency. And like I can certainly see the benefit of these unions all coming together and going, well, what is our shared vision for the future of the game?
Yeah, well, I think you're right, Gerald. I mean, they're a catalyst, really, and in terms of bringing people together, using their experience, particularly in the digital space, because I mean that's where rugby really needs to work hard. And to be fair, we've got a good digital program in the IRFU. It's probably second to none, certainly in this country, and across world rugby, it's probably right up there. But having said that, we're still in the halfpenny place compared to some other sports. And I think it's about using CVC as a catalyst to actually launch rugby to up the next rung of the ladder of professional sport, because we simply can't continue to operate on the basis of being dependent on the number of people we get through the stadium door and the ticket price that we charge. I mean, there's a limit to that. In the case of the Aviva Stadium, it's 51,000. That's as big as it gets. You can't make it any bigger. And there's only so much elasticity in ticket pricing that the public will bear. So we have to find new and additional sources of revenue. And certainly that whole digital space is where we believe there's a new turn.
Sorry, Chair. In relation to the English Premiership, there was conversations in the last couple of weeks about increasing the salary cap or making certain the marquee players still go. That seems to try and push it back up again. Do you think there'll be a stabilising in the UK?
I don't think they have any choice, to be honest. It's not a club rugby in England in the PRL is not sustainable outside of one or two clubs. They've managed to wash their face. They're well organised and they have a good business model. A lot of the clubs are dependent on individual owners pumping money into the clubs, and that works for a while as long as there's someone there who's willing to pump money into the club. But if they decide that it's a choice between going to the rugby club that I own every second week or my yacht in the Med, and it's a choice between the two, and they choose the yacht in the Med, well, sure, there may be another owner to step in, but it's not a sustainable business, really. And the values, the commercial values, just simply aren't there. And I think that the difficulty has been that there's been an arms race, for want of a better term, between some of the clubs in England and around player salaries, and it just simply there's got to be some sort of a cap there. Otherwise, it's going to destroy the PRL as a in terms of sporting integrity and as a competition.
Like if we go back to 25 years, and you said you were slow out of the blocks in terms of professionalising the game in Ireland, so were the RFU, and we had their former commercial director on a couple of weeks ago, and so we were having a discussion about that, and the RFU were slow out of the blocks. The owners in the Premiership have put themselves into an incredibly strong position, albeit they're losing multi-millions every year, but they're in a very strong power position. Do you think there's any chance or opportunity for them to blend back in with the RFU again? Do you think there's a common purpose or common ground for them?
It's a good question. I think the horse is bolted on that one. I don't think it'll be possible for the RFU to effectively move to a situation like we have. And I mean, I'd love to claim that we were prescient and it was all, good business management and all the rest of that. We ended up in a situation where we held the player contracts. The fact of the matter is there was no club in Ireland capable of the financial resource, or would have to have the financial resources to actually put a professional game in place. Whereas in England, it's obviously different. Individuals with large amounts of disposable income, and there are many of them in the UK, who are prepared to do so. I think trying to put that genie back in the bottle and trying to move back to centralised contracts in the UK would be very difficult. it may well be that they'll move possibly to a situation where they control a squad of players who would make up their international squad, which is kind of a halfway house. And you know, to some extent, they've gone part way down that road. But that's probably as good as it get. The other interesting thing is this, and it's uniquely it's European in some respects. This notion that you can have open competitions with promotion and relegation, and if it's not an open competition with promotion and relegation, there really isn't a competition at all, and it's of no interest to anyone. The fact of the matter is, the best professional sports in the world are all closed leagues, where you are able to effectively invest in your competition, invest in your facilities, invest in the infrastructure and the players. I think Pro 14 we're in a position where we can do that and have been able to do that. And I think one of the difficulties with the PRL and Top 14 to some extent as well is the fear in the middle of the table that you could drop out, and if you drop out, you might never get back up again, and it becomes quite tricky running a professional sport at what is really its infancy. I mean, professional rugby is in its infancy, but if you know, in a situation where you can't invest properly because of the fear of relegation, it really doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. AFL, NBA, the NFL, they're all closed leagues, and they're the successful professional sports.
I know we're jumping around a little bit, but I'm reacting to some of the things you said. So you talk about the Six Nations, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about whether there would be a relegation for the last team. Look, I'm not in favour of that myself either. But what I would say is that Italy have had 20 years in the Six Nations, and it hasn't really worked out well for them. You know, their game hasn't radically improved. They're always in the bottom two within it. Is there any chance of them dropping out of it altogether, and a team maybe along the similar timeline as South Africa, same timeline as us, might pop in instead?
Well, I think the reality, well, I mean, Italian rugby has struggled for a number of reasons, and one is I don't think they're particularly well organised, and you know, I think Conor O'Shea and his appointment, they actually have started to turn things around, and you can see that in the results at Treviso, and it's just going to take a little bit of time, and you may well ask, well, how much more time? But I think the whole issue of relegation in the Six Nations is, and again, it was put about that it was around the fear of Ireland and Scotland and other unions that you might get relegated, and it was too much jeopardy. Well, the jeopardy really is the professional sport. I mean, we generate the money that we generate from the Six Nations actually funds professional sport and professional rugby. It also funds the amateur game. To get relegated, the first thing that would happen is we would probably, if we ended up going into a second-tier competition, playing Georgia, Russia, Spain, Portugal, Germany, the reality is we would probably have to shed 2 professional teams immediately because of the impact it would have on our finances. And in those circumstances, what you're actually doing is, instead of stabilizing the game or improving the game, you're actually destabilizing the game and possibly disimproving the game. And so it becomes existential. And so the reality is, if you lose, for us to lose a team, or for Italy to lose 2 teams through relegation, it would be almost impossible to put it back together again. So what we have to try and do is preserve what we have, as opposed to trying to look over the fence and say, well, the far off fields are greener. But if the fact of the matter is, Georgia are always touted as, you know, the possible team to come in instead of Italy. Italy have beaten Georgia on numerous occasions, and the record is there. I think I don't think you'd be getting a massive improvement by bringing in Georgia. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to try and improve Georgia, and improve the other European teams. And that's very much part and parcel of what the Six Nations need to do, along with Rugby Europe and World Rugby, is try and improve things. But at this point in time, that's probably down the agenda. Survival is really the name of the game at the moment.
What about the notion of South Africa playing in our time zone and maybe being added to in a new calendar, a new rugby calendar? Is that even a discussion at any point?
I don't think well, certainly there hasn't been a discussion as far as I've been concerned. I know that lots of people discuss lots of things, and there's lots of chat about this and about that. But I mean, at the moment, they play in Super Rugby. They play in the Rugby Championship, and as far as I know, there's contracts in place for the continuation of that. And so, but I mean, at the moment, 2 years could be a long time in rugby, or a long time in sport, given where we are at the moment. So who knows what might happen in the future.
Philip, if we go to that now, do you see rugby going to be changed drastically? Do you see it down to being 10 aside, 7 aside for a period of time? How are competitions going to be started, both in a professional and a domestic sense?
Yeah, well, in the amateur game, I think we probably end up starting with the short forms of the game. It makes perfect sense that we do that, and in fact, the short forms of the game might also happen in the professional game. The sevens rugby is probably an easier sell to public health authorities than the 15-a-side game. Having said that, the finance of the entire game is dependent on 15-a-side rugby being played in full houses at club level and full houses at international level. And unless we can get back to that position, I think there's going to be a real problem for rugby as a sport. And it's very easy to switch everything off. It's much harder to switch it back on again. We've submitted detailed return to train, return to play, and event management protocols to the Sport Ireland's expert group, and effectively we've driven a stake into the ground, I suppose, of saying we have to have some target to aim for. We're aiming for the 22nd of August to start up a set of interprovincial derbies as part of the tail end of the Pro 14 season, and we play them in a controlled environment in the Aviva Stadium. And that unless we have that stake in the ground, it becomes very difficult to plan for anything. So we have laid out how we're going to do it, and it's best practice from various sports from around the world, and of course best practice is changing all the time, because as we get the experience of what happens in Bundesliga and other sports which have come back into play, we'll probably inevitably end up changing how we do things. But we have a plan. We have a date, and one would hope that the government and NEFIT and Department of Health will look at those seriously. And if they don't like it, they need to come back and tell us why they don't like it. And then we try and change it. And we need to work with the government and with the health authorities to try and make it happen. And I don't think simply no is not a good enough answer. We need to understand why, if it is going to be no, why is it no, and what can we change to make it happen. But certainly the rugby economy is dependent on people coming through gates and watching matches, and on broadcasters and on sponsorship. And in particular, I think for the big international matches, if we don't move back to a position where we have full houses, or we can get spectators through the styles, pretty soon we're all going to be, all the major rugby unions are going to be in difficulty.
Would you be looking in terms of a government subsidy until that happens?
I think we may have to. The reality is, we're not the only sport in this position. I mean, the GAA are in the same position. The FAI are in the same position. They're dependent on the big matches generating the revenues, which support the multiplicity of activities that go on in their sports and at club level. And so they're in exactly the same boat. And as I say, it's easy to switch it all off. It's much harder to switch it back on again. And if you lose an NGB, or if you start losing clubs, you know, at that stage it becomes very difficult to put it all back together again.
Are you concerned that that might happen, that we could be close enough to that happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said earlier, you know, professional sport is a marginal business. We don't bank huge reserves. We spend the money we earn in terms of keeping 4 professional teams going, keeping the national team going, keeping the women's team going, sevens teams going, and also supporting the amateur club game to the tune of about 10-11 million euro a year. So it's not as if there's you know, reserves. There aren't. We spend the money we earn, and we're a not-for-profit organisation, and so the reality is the cash is limited. Yes, you could go off and borrow, but you know, there's nobody should get engaged in borrowing funds unless they have some idea as to how they're going to repay them. And at this point in time, I have no idea how we would repay any debt we took on.
In terms of how a government subsidy might work, would you be hoping that would be a grant, or even if it was a long-term loan that the government were the ultimate backstop or guarantors on at a reasonable interest rate? Have you had those conversations with government yet?
Yeah, we're having conversations around the margins. I mean, to be honest, the first number of weeks really have been trying to deal with the immediate impact of the crisis, and I think those conversations it's now the natural next stage, which is to talk about, well, where are we going to end up if we cannot start up sport again in a meaningful way? And I think there'll be a fair degree of anxiety amongst all the major sports, and not just the major sports, all sport, as to how are we going to restart. And if we can't restart, what are the implications? And you know, the implications for society are significant. The field sports in particular provide organised sport for, you know, hundreds of thousands of kids, and it is not something that any society would want to lose, because if you do not effectively ingrain sport and activity with kids at a young age, you're building up a real problem later on in life for the health system with people who are not active. And so sport has a value. It just doesn't have a value just in that context. It has a value in terms of, you know, cohesion of society and coherence. And I think all of those things mean the sport has a value, leaving aside the employment in sport. So I think to be fair to government and Sport Ireland, I think they understand that. How they're going to deal with it is another matter, because there's a lot of hungry mouths out there across all sectors of society and across all sectors of business. So it's an unenviable task for government, but they do need to understand that sport, it's existential for some sports.
Philip, if you look at what would be palatable, I think, to everybody, it would be that domestic game, and that you know, the amount of kids that play rugby and all the benefits that they get from that. I think they could understand the subsidy there. I think that would be much harder for professional players. Are pay cuts on the horizon for our professional group?
Well, we've already imposed with their agreement. Impose is the wrong word. With the agreement of the players, we have a salary deferral scheme in place, and so we're in the second month of that. But I mean, we simply cannot build up a set of deferred salary liabilities without potentially in the knowledge that we're not going to be able to pay them. So I don't see that that's a long-term solution. At the time when the crisis first hit in March, everyone thought, well, we'll be back training, June, and we'll be playing out the end of the season in July and August. Well, that's all changed now. So I think the salary deferral scheme is something that certainly we need to be looking at. And ultimately, if we have to cut wages, we have to cut wages if that's what's going to help us get to the other end in one piece. And unpalatable as it is, we wouldn't be the only organisation in the country who's having to face up to these issues.
In terms of the pathway that you put out in the stake of the ground, as you said, of August 22nd, there were lots of weekends in there where we could all begin to dream about maybe seeing the end of the Six Nations, and potentially, if friends are allowed to travel, that they would actually play in Dublin against Leinster in the Heineken Cup. Since then, there have been a bunch of proposals that Francis Barron made public over the last 24 hours or so for a potentially world tournament next summer. How do those ideas get passed around? What's the process for a conversation even beginning to start around what might happen next summer?
It appears that Francis Barron talks to the media first. That's how everything gets passed around. And then he sends a letter to, I don't know who he sends the letter to, but it's, I'm like yourself, I read the newspapers every day, and it's the first I heard of it. I assume someone will have a discussion with him somewhere along the line. But it's, at the end of the day, can I see that working? I don't know.
What do you think would happen next summer? Or what in an ideal world, is it normal Six Nations as scheduled next year, and we get back to some semblance at least of the fixture list of normality?
Well, there's a Lions tour scheduled for next. So, the Lions is the biggest brand in rugby by a long shot, and I think that's one of the things that's out there. And if we have a dearth of rugby, I think, but we can play the Lions, I think that would be enormously positive for the game worldwide. And they're playing in South Africa, obviously, against the world champions. That adds value to it all. I'd hope that we'd be playing international rugby in October or November, and I hope we'd be playing the Six Nations next February, March. The issue is, what's that going to look like? Is it going to be behind closed doors or not? And again, time will tell. We're just not quite certain how it's going to pan out.
Is the home and away Six Nations an option that's on the table? It's been talked about in the media a good bit as well.
There's at this point in time, everyone is planned out, because we're planning against a set of moving targets, and nobody knows what is or is not possible. Nobody knows what the public health regulations across a multiplicity of different jurisdictions is actually going to look like. So there's all sorts of wild and wonderful tournament structures being dreamed up, and all sorts of plans for X, Y, and Z. But the reality is, nothing is really in stone, because we just don't know. I would imagine that really by the end of June, July, we need to be starting to get some sort of shape on what we are actually going to plump for. I think obviously the July tours have gone, and rugby is starting up in New Zealand and Australia. Whether it starts up in South Africa, I'm not sure when that'll happen. And I suppose the big question mark is, will the Southern Hemisphere teams be able to travel up north in October, November? If they can, well, that's great. If they can't, well, then we're going to have to find some way of playing international fixtures amongst ourselves within Europe. And someone said you could have the COVID Cup, which would be, some sort of cup competition. You could have home and away Six Nations. You could have a wider group of European unions outside of the Six Nations. There's all sorts of potential opportunities or to actually play international rugby. As to which one is it going to be, I don't know.
Philip, do you think that the the rugby ramifications for this could be clubs going out of business, could be amateur clubs going out of business, more unions going to the wall?
If it goes on for a long time, for argument's sake, if we can't play international rugby this year, or if we can't play rugby this year, or if we lose the Six Nations next year, I think it's existential for certainly rugby unions within the Six Nations. I would say it's existential for all of us. The same goes for Southern Hemisphere. Australia, obviously, their financial difficulties are well publicised, and I think what would have to happen is unions would have to take decisions just to pull the shutters down and try and mothball, and obviously that creates another set of difficulties, which, as I say, it's easy to shut things down. It's much harder to open them back up again. At club level, amateur club level, I think there's a lot of clubs out there suffering. They're not just suffering in rugby, they're suffering across a multiplicity of sports in Ireland. And, at the end of the day, if we lose our volunteers at that level, because they've moved on, there's no sport, they've moved on, they're doing other things, or alternatively, really, they don't want to get involved in a failing club where they're exposed themselves. If we lose all of that, I think it's almost impossible to put it back together again. It's very hard to start a club. It's very hard to keep a club going. But if at the end of the day they find themselves in a situation where they simply can no longer remain open and remain a going concern, I think that there will be clubs that are going to be in big difficulty, and I think the government, and maybe I was being a bit sensationalist saying that it could take it the other day when I said it. We could take sport a generation to get back to where it was, but I genuinely believe that if we start losing clubs in GAA, soccer, rugby, you name it, my background is rowing. I know that my rowing club is in difficulty as well. The reality is it'll be very hard to get it all back together again. And I think government need to be aware. I think, to be fair, I think they are aware of it. As to what they're going to be able to do, I don't know.
It's a bleak enough picture. I was kind of hoping that the return of rugby in the Southern Hemisphere would give us some green shoots to look forward to. And I actually think August 22nd is far enough away for, if there are any issues that the government might have or the health authorities might have, that we should be able to work through those.
That's right, and that's essentially what we're trying to do. We want to work through the issues, and rather than waiting for someone to say, well, you can go back, in 6 months' time or 9 months' time, or rather just keep us on the hook until they feel comfortable. I think we need to work with the authorities to try and make it happen, because if we don't, we could be sitting here waiting for a long time. And I think, Southern Hemisphere, New Zealand, effectively, and Australia, they haven't had the same level of infection as we've had in this country, and effectively in New Zealand they've wiped out the virus, and so it's a different set of circumstances. But having said that, we're obviously in touch with New Zealand, trying to understand what they're doing in terms of return to train and return to play. And I think Australia are looking at doing something similar, maybe another few weeks down the road from New Zealand. And I would say probably some sort of trans-Tasman competition is probably the most likely first sort of competition that's likely to happen, because of the unique nature of Australia and New Zealand in terms of the level of infection that they have, and the way in which they managed to effectively suppress to a large extent the whole disease.
I think the whole world is watching that. Philip, you've been great with your time. We wish you the very best of luck, and thanks very much for being this week's guest.